The Philippines is a land of beauty and mystery, its islands cloaked in ancient lore and whispers of the supernatural. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to the skin like an unwelcome memory. Capiz, a province nestled in the heart of the Philippines, carried an air of mystery that never quite faded, no matter how bright the daylight. But it was never the days that kept people wary. It was the nights, when the line between folklore and reality blurred, and the tales of the Aswang slithered through the towns like whispers in the dark. No one ever came to Capiz without hearing the stories. They were etched into the soil, tangled in the roots of ancient trees, and carried in the wary glances of its people. The Aswang were shapeshifters, creatures of shadow and hunger. They could walk among you in the day, smiling and speaking like ordinary folk, only to shed their human guise at night. It was said they feasted on human flesh, their thirst unquenchable, their cruelty unparalleled. Some claimed they were demons, others insisted they were cursed souls. Either way, one thing was certain, the Aswang were no bedtime story. Evangeline Reyes was a woman of science, a journalist who prided herself on separating fact from fiction. When she was assigned to investigate a series of grisly murders in Capiz, she approached the task with the same clinical detachment that had carried her through war zones and gang-infested slums. She was no stranger to death, nor to the paranoia it bred. But Capiz was different. It wasn't just the murders, brutal, almost ritualistic killings that left the victims unrecognizable. It was the fear that clung to the survivors, the way they avoided her questions, the way they wouldn't look her in the eye. Her first night in Capiz was uneventful, save for the unnerving quiet. Even the stray dogs that usually roamed the streets of small towns were absent. Evangeline set up her equipment in the small, dimly lit inn she was staying at. She reviewed her notes, cross-referencing the details of each murder. The victims were young women, all found in the early hours of the morning, their bodies torn apart as though by some great beast. The police were quick to attribute the killings to wild animals. But the townsfolk whispered of the Aswang. Evangeline scoffed at the notion, but noted it anyway. It was near midnight when she first heard the sound, a faint scratching at the window. She dismissed it as a tree branch swaying in the wind and went back to her work. But the sound came again, more insistent this time. She turned off the lamp, her fingers brushing the cold steel of the pistol she always kept at her side. The moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting long, pale streaks across the room. She approached the window cautiously, her breath shallow. Peering out into the darkness, she saw nothing but shadows. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, a gnawing sensation at the base of her skull. The next day, Evangeline ventured deeper into the town, speaking to anyone who would entertain her questions. Most refused, their faces tightening at the mention of the Aswang. Others muttered prayers under their breath, clutching rosaries as though they could ward off her inquiries. It was only an old woman, wrinkled and hunched, who dared to speak freely. She sat on the porch of her crumbling home, her cataract-clouded eyes fixed on the horizon. "They come for the weak," the woman said, her voice a rasp. "They smell your fear, your pain. Once they've marked you, they don't stop, not until they've had their fill." Evangeline pressed her for more details, but the old woman only shook her head. "You can't fight them," she whispered. "You can only run." That night, Evangeline armed herself with her pistol and a flashlight, determined to explore the forest where some of the bodies had been found. The locals had warned her against it, their voices trembling as they spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. She dismissed their warnings as superstition, but kept the Glock loaded all the same. The forest was a labyrinth of twisted trees and tangled undergrowth, the air thick with the scent of decay. Every step felt like an intrusion, every sound like a warning. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, that revealing claw marks on the trunks of trees and patches of ground where the grass had been scorched. Her heart raced, the adrenaline drowning out her skepticism. Then she heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She spun around, the flashlight shaking in her hand. The growl came again, closer this time, and she caught a glimpse of something. Something hunched and impossibly fast, darting between the trees. Her finger tightened on the trigger as she scanned the darkness, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. The creature emerged from the shadows, its form grotesque and inhuman. It walked on two legs but moved with a predatory grace, its body twisted as though it had been broken and reassembled by a madman. Its eyes burned like molten iron, and its mouth stretched into a jagged grin, revealing teeth that glistened with blood. It let out a shriek, a sound so piercing it felt like knives being driven into her skull. Evangeline fired, the shots echoing through the forest. The creature recoiled, black ichor spraying from its wounds. But it didn't fall. It lunged at her with unnatural speed, its claws raking the air where she had stood moments before. She stumbled backward, firing wildly, the bullets tearing into its misshapen body. Finally, it collapsed, writhing on the ground as its flesh began to bubble and melt. The stench was overwhelming, a sickly sweet odor that made her gag. When the creature finally stilled, its body dissolved into a pool of black liquid, seeping into the earth as though it had never existed. Evangeline stood there, her chest heaving, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. The rational part of her screamed for an explanation. Hallucination, hysteria, anything but what it seemed to be. The following days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. The townsfolk grew more hostile, their eyes accusing, their whispers venomous. Even the old woman who had spoken to her refused to answer her knocks. Evangeline felt the weight of unseen eyes on her at all times, the shadows in her room stretching and shifting when she wasn't looking. She began to hear whispers, faint and insidious, seeping into her thoughts like poison. They spoke of hunger, of flesh, of her. By the time she decided to leave, it was too late. The townsfolk were gone, their homes abandoned, the streets eerily silent. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and the sky was an unnatural shade of gray. She drove through the empty town, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her eyes darting to every shadow. When her car broke down at the edge of the forest, she cursed and reached for her phone, only to find it dead. The growls came then, low and guttural, growing louder with every passing second. She grabbed her pistol, stepping out into the oppressive silence. They came from the trees, dozens of them, their forms a grotesque parody of humanity. Their eyes burned with a malevolent hunger, and their mouths twisted into monstrous grins. At their center stood a figure she recognized, the old woman, her frail body now replaced with something unholy. She smiled, her teeth glistening with blood. "You cannot leave," she said, her voice a chorus of agony and malice. "You are marked." Evangeline raised her pistol, her hands shaking. She fired, the bullets tearing through the creatures, but it was no use. They closed in, their laughter echoing in her ears, a cacophony of madness. Her screams pierced the night, a final, desperate plea that was swallowed by the darkness. When a new journalist was sent to Capiz weeks later, they found nothing but an abandoned car and a blood-stained pistol. The town was deserted, the forest eerily quiet, but the whispers remained, carried on the wind, speaking of hunger, of flesh, of home.